Welcome to the conversation at the New York State Writers Institute here at the University at Albany State University of New York. I'm Mark Koplik, Assistant Director. We're excited to be here today with K-Ming Chang and Kazim Ali. Poet and fiction writer K-Ming Chang is the author of the acclaimed new debut novel, Bestiary, from Random House. It's about 3 generations of Taiwanese American women who are possessed by the mythologies and the animals of their homeland. It's a magical realist world where a girl grows the tail of a tiger, women carry snakes in their belly, and give birth to wild geese. The book explores one family's queer desires, violent impulses, and buried secrets. Oprah.com called it gorgeous and gorgeously grotesque and said, every line of this sensuous, magical, realist novel is utterly alive. Last month, the National Book Foundation, which awards the National Book Awards, named K-Ming Chang to its 5 under 35 list, which honors only 5 up-and-coming authors under the age of 35. She's also a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award, honoring writers who explore LGBT themes. She has a chapbook forthcoming in 2021, Bone House, which is a queer retelling of Wuthering Heights. She wrote the manuscript for Bestiary at the age of 19. At the age of 22, she is the youngest author to be featured in our series. And I hope that she gives us permission to marvel about her age. We're thrilled that this interview will be used as a classroom resource here at the University at Albany in our English 350 class, Contemporary Writers at Work, where the students will be her generational peers. You'll find more about the new novel here on this website. You can purchase Bestiary, a novel, via a link to an indie bookstore here on this page. K-Ming, thank you for joining us. We're also excited to be here with Kazim Ali, acclaimed poet, novelist, translator, memoirist, professor, and most importantly for us, a distinguished alumnus of the University at Albany. He got his BS in 1993 and his MA in English in 1995. He's currently a professor of literature and creative writing at the University of California, San Diego. I want to bring your attention to the fact that following his graduation from UAlbany, Kazim worked full-time for 4 years advocating for greater funding for the SUNY system, greater access to public higher education, and increased need-based grant aid for students. You can find out a lot more about Kazim and his award-winning poetry collections, novels, essay collections, and translations here on this page. Today, we're going to be focusing on his forthcoming memoir, Northern Light, Power, Land, and the Memory of Water, which you'll be able to pre-order via a link on this page. It's not magical realism, but it sometimes feels like it. It's the story of Kazim's unlikely childhood, partly spent with his Muslim Indian family in a community of trailers that grew up around a hydroelectric dam project in the wilds of northern Canada. Kazim returns to this temporary community, not only in memory, but in person as an adult when he connects with the indigenous Native American community that was displaced and harmed by this same hydroelectric project. Kazim, welcome back, and welcome back virtually to your alma mater. I'll start with a couple of questions. For our students, our young people, do you have any advice on how they can find their voices and how they can find the courage to express themselves?
That's a really good question to start with. K-Ming, I want to invite you to.
Oh yeah, I can speak first. Yeah. I think for me, I don't know, I was always really intimidated by the concept of finding my voice, I think, because I was so focused on like, oh, I have to kind of acquire all these external things, you know, forms of validation in order to have like, you know, found that voice. And I think something that helped me, I don't know, unlock some part of myself was thinking about how much I already possessed, and how much it was just about kind of trusting myself and also having a kind of like inner teacher as well. Because I think finding a voice can often feel like, oh, I have to like go out and and you know, like acquire all these different things and, you know, the different accolades and different degrees and things like that. And that can definitely be part of the process as well, and can be really generative and important. But also, yeah, I think that just learning to kind of trust that I had stories as well already, and that my voice was already something that or many voices, that we all have these many voices that are kind of already inherently in us. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, thank God, that I didn't wait to find that voice. I also think that as a South Asian person, Muslim person in America, so I spent the first 10 years of my life in Canada, and I cannot say what kind of writer I might have grown into had I stayed. I certainly know that America, the United States of America in the 1980s, was an openly hostile place to Muslim people. And I felt that keenly, and as a gay person, and I felt that keenly too, even though I was, you know, 12, 13, 14, like I was really aware of the dialogue that was happening around LGBTQ people, and this is during the AIDS epidemic, I guess you would say the early days. And it was a hostile place, even though I was, you know, growing up in middle class in the suburbs. I was I keenly felt my otherness. And I think that sharpened my sense of my divorce, I guess, from a kind of whatever mainstream literary voice there was. I also knew that, and I was interested in writing fiction first before poetry, but I knew that the mainstream voices that I was listening to and reading in high school, both in fiction and in poetry, were not the ways that I wanted to approach literature myself. So I think it took a lot of schooling, actually, before I really was able to give myself permission to kind of, what you said very eloquently, actually, K-Ming, which is to recognize that the voices are inside you, and that what permission there is to be given is the permission that you have to give yourself, actually. I don't mind saying that my education at the University at Albany really helped, because the English department there combined, you know, I was reading, you know, contemporary poetry, but I was also reading philosophy and literary theory. And it helps me to think about, in many ways, it helped me to think about, you know, why the dominant narrative was the dominant narrative, and, you know, what it meant to find voices of alterity. And, you know, so I was understanding that both intellectually and as a creative artist. And I think that was a supportive place to be, as opposed to a place where I was really learning the canon and having the approach to the canon drilled into me. I mean, that is not something that happened in my undergraduate education.
So, K-Ming, something you said, and this is really for both of you, seemed to suggest that young people already possess the wisdom to write great work, or do they need to work hard to discover it, to seek it? Do you need to be born an old soul, or do you need to cram several decades of life experience and reading into a very short span?
Oh, well, I think that oftentimes, like I mean, at least for me, I know that I mean, I do look back on things I've written, I'm like, it doesn't have to be good, you know, or I look back and I'm like really embarrassed, but I think it's just part of the process. And I think one thing that I really loved about like writing when I was in undergrad, and also like even in high school too, is I wasn't necessarily thinking of like what it would take shape into. Like I was just kind of doing it as a practice for myself, rather than thinking of like, oh, this is going to be like some kind of product that, you know, people have to read. And yeah, so I think definitely like I think one thing that was like really kind of liberating for me when I was younger was not necessarily having to think, oh, like, oh, this has to be, you know, like brilliant and wise, but that it could also be just like playful and creative or regenerative or healing in some way. And that was really freeing for me. Yeah.
You, Kazim, was it hard to overcome the inhibitions, the whatever it is that might prevent a person from writing as a young person?
I mean, very much so. I want to say, unfortunately, I don't think I had your bravery, K-Ming, or I mean, it was also a little bit of a different world. I don't mind saying. I had a really, I mean, there was a lot of trauma for me around silence, around familial stuff, and around sexuality, and it took. I mean, even when I was even after I was publishing books, I was still not, you know, really out in my family, and so there were still things that in my, you know, earliest published books, I don't really directly engage questions of gender or sexuality. It didn't have, you know, that was what I was 36 years old when I came out to my parents. You know, so it was a grown, I mean, I have students now who are, you know, they're 19 and they've been out to their parents for 7 years or something like that. So it's just different. And I think that really was a huge, the stricture of silence is strong. Especially I think when it comes to family stuff. I think that's something that every writer wrestles with actually. You know, what secrets are you allowed to tell? You know, what of your life that impacts other people? What can be brought into the work? Certainly when you're doing fiction, there's a way in which you can, you know, it becomes a kind of defense almost in a certain way that maybe in poetry or nonfiction one has less of. But for me, it was a long road and I don't feel at the end of it. There are times when I read books where I feel like I still don't have the bravery today to be able to write a book like that. I mean, reading Bestiary, how does one say this word?
I don't know either. I kind of just say, let anyone say whatever pronunciation they'd like. Yeah.
I too felt a sort of, you know, complicated envy that a writer feels where you wish you could have written that book. Not, oh, you know, the bad kind of envy. It's the good kind of envy where you see a book that has a bravery and verve in its approach and the accomplishment of it, and wish you had the resources to do such a thing. So I think there's a lot, you know, I don't feel achieved, you know, yet. I feel like there's a long road for me left in terms of finding my voice and being able to tell every truth there is.
And K-Ming, are you uncomfortable being thought of as a prodigy at all? I mean, folks must be astonished at your youth and your accomplishment. Does that ever bother you?
Well, I definitely like don't identify as a prodigy. I feel like that would be really kind of strange and narcissistic if I went around being like, yeah. I feel like I don't necessarily have control over what people want to call me or label me, and so I often don't even try. I kind of just I'm like, I only kind of have control over what I say, and so I kind of back away from it a bit. But I also think it's kind of a strange, like the idea of a prodigy is like really kind of strange and unrealistic, and I definitely wouldn't want like students to feel like, oh, I either have to be a prodigy or I'm gonna be nothing, because that's so like dangerous and just like really just really unrealistic. And the idea, like, I know like growing up that there were so many like people around me who thought, oh, like I have to do everything by a certain age or like that's it, and that kind of like capitalist mindset I think is still something that like really is really haunting and really difficult and can like just prevent one from wanting to do anything or write anything. And so, yeah, I try to kind of not like invest into those narratives. Yeah.
I think that's really smart and wise, actually, because it's, if you don't mind me saying it, it is a dangerous place as well,
Mm-hmm.
because others may have expectations of you, and it may inhibit you in certain ways from whatever your own artistic vision is, whatever you feel like there is for you to do next. Because what makes your writing unique is what you brought to it. And so then suddenly there may be some pressure of, do you have to write another book that is like that, or what have you? Do you know what I mean? Instead of, I don't want to romanticize, I don't at all the, being obscure, quote unquote, or like not having attention. But the freedom of that is certainly that, no one's paying attention to you. There's a purity to that in a certain way. Do you know what I mean? Do you understand what I'm getting at?
Yeah, actually, it was really funny because I read on it was an article, but I read once like, oh, no one's really waiting for your book. And I remember thinking about like, no one's really waiting. And I was like, oh, that's so true. Like, I love, that's kind of freeing to think about that, like, no one's ever really waiting. Yeah, it's what made me think of. Yeah.
And I think that it's a healthy attitude as a writer to feel that way, no matter what the situation is. Certainly we're hoping for a broad audience for your book, but in a way you as a writer do, as you said, you as a writer do have to sort of like turn the page on it and be like, okay, that's a thing that's happening right now, but I am whatever the new thing is, focus it. Mm-hmm. Marguerite Duras, who's one of my favorite writers of all.
Oh, yes, yes.
She said, you don't show a book you're working on to anybody. Anybody, she said that. And this was at the height of her fame, like not an agent, not a publisher, not an editor, nobody, not until you're ready to give it over to be published. Like it is just in your little, she had 2 different houses and she went back and forth. So she said, it's in your suitcase and it stays there. Nobody sees it.
You're both poets and prose writers, and it would be interesting to know how you feel poetry helps you as a prose writer, and wonder whether you would encourage students to experiment with various forms in order to broaden their palette.
Yeah, I mean, always. I've never chosen. I've always just written what I felt like writing. And some of the fiction that I write is extremely lyrical and poetic, like to the extreme. And some of it isn't. And, I think every project leads you a little bit on a different path. With my book, Northern Light, that you mentioned, it's very much, very much a kind of a journalism, a little bit of a memoir. It's like an essayistic engagement with what happened. Yeah, there are moments of flourishes in the language and the occasional lyrical section, but mostly not. On the other hand, my memoir, Bright Felon, was so extremely lyrical and poetic in its approach that it was actually published as a book of poetry. Because I sent it to all these publishers who are looking at memoirs, and they were, universally said, this is not actually what you think it is. And so I sent it to a poetry publisher, and they accepted it and slapped poetry on the back. It reminds me a little bit of Maxine Hong Kingston's battle with her publisher when she first published The Woman Warrior, and they called it a memoir. Yeah. And so now if you look at, there's a history of The Woman's Warrior with the back, where they put the little category for the booksellers, where it will say like memoir or fiction or whatever. And if you look at the earliest public publishings of The Woman Warrior and then see the different editions through the years, you'll see it changes. And it turned from like memoir to memoir / nonfiction. Then it was nonfiction / literature. Then it was fiction / literature. And now the newest ones just say fiction.
Yeah.
She had this long battle to say this is a novel that they wouldn't
Yeah.
say that way in the beginning.
Yeah, that's true. I think oftentimes genre, like, it is kind of a marketing a marketing tool. And yeah, I think just like, as long as, for me, it's just like, as long as I'm interested in what I'm writing, I try not to kind of feel too like intimidated by like a certain genre category. Yeah, I think when I was writing Bestiary too, like, there were definitely moments where it was it felt very kind of like poetic, or I was writing in a formally in a way that kind of broke some conventions of prose. But and there were parts of me that really, I was like, I should change it, like, I shouldn't do this. But yeah, I had to kind of really resist that, and think of something like genre as something that is kind of placed onto it, rather than necessarily where the work begins. Though maybe people do sit down thinking like, oh, I'm going to write a short story. Like, maybe there are, and maybe that's the process that works for a lot of people. In which case, I really admire that. But I think for me, it's really hard to like, yeah, have genre in the forefront of my mind. Otherwise, I get like really intimidated by like, oh, well, is it enough of a story? Is it enough of a poem? And then, yeah, that can be really like inhibitive. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if it's like a trend. Maybe it's a trend that's drifting a little towards the more accepting, but I think in general, for a long time, American publishing specifically has demanded a little bit of a narrower focus on genre from writers, as opposed to, if you look at, you know, European fiction, especially Eastern European fiction, but just fiction around the world, like there's been a little bit more of a cross-genre acceptance of terms of mixing of modes. But then you see books like, you know, Bestiary, of course, your book Bestiary, and Ocean Vuong's recent novel, and others, where I think there's a little more, there's like a widening of the gate or something right now, which is exciting to me as a reader.
So would you guys like to ask questions of each other?
I mean, sure. I want to ask you, K-Ming, I enjoyed so much reading your
book. Thank you.
It's really powerful. And I wanted to ask you about the animalistic in it. So of course you have the transformation, the various transformations that happen. And it's almost as if, like, I thought of two different quotes that sort of embodied a little bit that transformation. Very early on, the mother says, we can never be clean enough for this country. And so it's almost like they cannot remain human. They almost have to, like, it's almost a survival strategy, the way that the various people embody the animalistic. Much later on, one of the characters asks this actual question: can bodies cross into other bodies? Which I don't know if that's a direct evocation of the metamorphosis, but I'm assuming it is. And I was curious about that, because not only is the more mythical transformation of the animal to human present, but also the maybe coarser elements of animal life. Like there's a lot of urine in this book. You know, there are numerous people, you know, wetting themselves, and you know, all manner of. There's a lot of metaphors. There's the piss dark honey that is given by the church, and you know, so that's one thing that I noticed. That is, you know, one of the things that separates a human from an animal is that except for cats, is that a human knows where to urinate, you know. An animal will just, you know, just on the ground, wherever they happen to be. So I'm curious about if you could talk about how that metaphor constructed itself across the book, but more in generally about the transformation that happens.
Thank you so much for highlighting those lines, and for this really insightful question. I guess I was thinking with that line of like not being clean enough for this country. I was thinking of a way in which like there was this pressure for this family to sanitize themselves in many ways, and that sanitizing taking place in both like a bodily way, but also in like a language way, or to kind of to have this like idea of a clean slate somehow that I think we often kind of expect of immigrants as well. And that there was this kind of refusal to be sanitized, or to be like clean in certain ways, thinking also of the way that they were converted to Christianity and this idea of like being born again, like therefore you're clean, you know, baptized. And yeah, I was really interested in their kind of refusal to be clean, and their insistence on being like very connected to land and to things that, you know, we consider kind of dirty or gross or base, crass in some way. And I think that's also where like a lot of the bodily functions and fluids come in, which I wasn't consciously thinking that I was doing that until much later when other people told me I was doing it. And I was like, oh, I didn't even notice. And I think it is like, I didn't want there to be a sense of like shame around these like functions and embodiedness, but rather there to be a sense of like intimacy around these kind of like bodily functions, because I think they are really intimate. And thinking of like talking to my family, like I wouldn't be embarrassed to like tell them about like my body or things like that. And well, with certain people, and I realized like those are the people that I'm most intimate with. And yeah, and so yeah.
When the boy wets himself at the zoo, you actually say a boy newly baptized in his body.
Yeah, I didn't even notice. Well, perfect. That goes along exactly with what I was saying. Yeah, and like, and thinking of transformation too, like, and like the animal, I don't know, it's also really interested in, because like the stories and fables that I grew up hearing, rather than this kind of like, oh, humans kind of elevated above all forms of life, and a kind of like, yeah, elevation of like of humans specifically, there was a sense of like the animal and the spiritual being very deeply fused together, and like divinity and animalness also being something that are really tied with each other, which is kind of a subversion, I think, of our more kind of Eurocentric understanding of like humans and animals and godhood and things like that. And
like the
yeah,
hierarchy is like the animals are even farther away from God, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so I kind of drawing from those different traditions, indigenous Taiwanese mythology as well. Like I was interested in yeah, a different form of storytelling and what that could look like. Yeah. I have a question for you. Yes, there were so many different like lines and sections that I highlighted, but the sentences that I want to read out loud that I think really, like I wrote it down in my journal because it was something I wanted to think more about too, is the sentence, it's on page 99, and it says, "The irony is that the migrant is clamoring for entry into the national space of Canada, while Indigenous are automatically excluded from it, have to be excluded for that national space to exist in the first place." That moment, it was just, I feel like oftentimes like, yeah, the making space of like understanding settler colonial dynamics and how that interacts with, yeah, immigrant narratives, and also what it means to be a migrant, and also like to be complicit in these systems as well. And yeah, all these different kind of complications of, I think, narratives that are kind of like more like, we typically think of those as really separate things somehow, that like settler colonialism and like migration are somehow these like two diverging narratives. And yeah, I was just really interested in what was it like doing like the research for that and exploring that. Yeah, and also I guess what was like the drive into yeah, I have many questions, but yeah, I would just love to hear more about your process. Yeah.
I mean, thank you for quoting that part. I mean, that was the heart of a lot of the book as I was writing it. That's not something I figured out or knew at the beginning of it. That's one of the things I learned. I mean, we don't think, so I came as an immigrant too. I mean, I moved to Canada as a young child, so I don't know what makes me like the 1.5 or something, whatever it is. I was born over there, and wherever over there is. In my case, it was England. So I was actually born once away from India, and then to Canada and then here. So I don't know. I mean, I just told you guys about how I too felt othered. So I didn't really identify as a settler myself or a colonist myself. I thought, well, my family's, I mean, there are lots of different reasons why people migrate. There's, you know, economic migrants, political, what have you, refugees. And the climate change migrants now is, you know, is going to be there as well. And my family, we were economic migrants, but in a way that too is political. But I never thought of myself as lucky in any way. You know, like life in the United States was, you know, we were middle class, so we had that. And when we lived in Canada, I think I was too young to really process what were we doing in the far north, building this dam, or like whose land was this? Like those are not questions I ever thought of. But I definitely didn't identify as part of the Canadian National Project. I felt excluded from it. And I never felt as part of the American National Project. I felt excluded from it. And yet I was on from one side of that project, because like that idea of America, you know, sea to shining sea, California to New York, that is an invention that when I got my passport or made my citizenship paper, which I became an American citizen when I was 17 years old, or maybe 18. So it was a long time before that. I was something else, many something else's. And the place that I'm most original to, India, is a place I don't have access to because neither of my parents have documents. I mean, they were born in the 40s. Neither one of them has a birth certificate. So if we wanted to reapply and kind of reclaim that, it's, do you know what my mom has when I asked her for her birth certificate? It's her enrollment paper from school, when she started school. That's the earliest document she has that says who she is. And for my dad, it's an affidavit signed by the neighbor saying, so-and-so had a son on this day. And there's like this little, whatever the notary was in the pre-independence India in South India. So when we think of documents, that like documents make you a person, instead of, well, I live here, I work here, my family lives here, we participate in this economy because we work here and we buy things here. Like, that's what makes a human, not what the paper is or what the, whereas in America, of course, it's you're excluded based on the paper. Got to be documented in a certain way, to the extent that even if you've lived here for your entire life, but your parents had the wrong kind of paper, and you maybe 4 months before you came to America were actually born on another scrap of earth somewhere else, you suddenly actually do not have rights here. It's a kind of insanity if you think about it. And so the immigrant is always, the position of the immigrant in the national space of America or Canada, which are the inventions. You know, yes, there's history. The narrative of the nation has been told for 200 plus years, or however long it is in both places. But we are not talking about a historic piece of land like I don't know what I can use as an example, like the island that Britannia, the island of Britain. It is a geographic space. It's that island. You know, America is like just what this continent, except this part of it is the river between, you know, Texas and Mexico, part of the border, but the rest of it is just a line on a map. And part of the northern border is the river and the lakes, but the rest of it is just a line on a map. So these are not real places. You know? I think that's what I really started to understand. And that the indigenous who are on the other side, who you have to erase the indigenous to have what's Canada, because before there was what's called Canada, there were just all of these different, you know, countless communities, First Nations across the continent. So
yeah, wow, that's really powerful. Yeah, definitely thinking of the nation state as a narrative and its own kind of myth. Yeah, is really powerful and terrifying. And also what you were saying about documentation makes me think of, like, in Taiwan, my mom, she always, like, she never quite knew what her like birthday on the Western calendar was, but she knew like what what it was on the lunar calendar, because she was like, oh, well, that day, like, oh, my dad was gambling, and so that means it was like the 5th day of the Lunar New Year, which is the day everyone gambled. So that's how she remembers. And then she never really like was like, oh, I need to kind of figure out what it is on the solar calendar. And so we did like this whole research process together of like figuring out what her birthday would be and like kind of the month day system that we have here. And yeah, no, it's just like really interesting what you were saying too, of like what it means to be quote unquote like American here is based on this very like violent and exclusive form of like documentation that has nothing to do with like what it means to like have a life and things like that.
Well, one of the things that you do in your book is that there become different ways of marking time. So at some point, the mother is telling a story and she says, mothers ago, as a way of explaining that this was a long time in the past. And then there's a great part around the birth certificate where at some point the birth certificate is in like some battered cookie tin. Such a resonant image, because maybe every immigrant family, there's like, it's those Danish butter cookies, right? The round. Yeah. You got all the papers in there, and then she's actually, I'm not doing spoilers, big spoilers, but like there's a part where she actually, so the mom has this chain of different jobs, like all these different, like almost every couple pages, there's a new job. And in one of them, she's working at the photocopy place and she gets fired because she's photocopying the birth certificate. And there was something about that I thought was really resonant, because it's in a way she's trying to like create the backup. And then of course the long, thread of them trying to find the gold buried in the yard. You know, there's always something that needs to be unearthed. There's something that's been hidden away in the way that we don't actually know. You know, I found it really, really like deeply moving that when she gets fired from the job for photocopying the birth certificate, that she steals all the lunches out of the work. Because like, you know, it's completely subversive to the order of things. You know, like, the response is to steal everyone's sandwiches and salad and everything, you know. It's just really great. I love that scene.
Oh, thank you. No, thank you. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. And also, yeah, the like, because I've always kind of struggled to talk about or to like use chronology in writing, and I don't know if you feel that way too, but also the memoir has like all these different forms of memory. I feel like there's like historical memory, there's personal memory, like observation, like different filters for different sorts of kinds of memories too. And like things like the mothers ago, I really wanted to instill this kind of like matriarchal time. And I was like, oh, I don't really quite know how to do that, like in the story itself with all of these women, but also like linguistically, maybe there was a way to evoke that. But yeah, I was really interested in, how you work with memory as well.
Well, I think both of our books actually require, I think we fell into multiple modes in a way. Because for me, the very first draft of this book, which became a book, was meant as a magazine article. And it was
really?
It was just me going back, and I was going to write the story of my going back. It was like a memoir of, I was going to go back to the town site, and I was going to go to the sweat lodge. They invited me to participate in the sweat lodge and meet with the chief, and then I was going to go back to the town site and try to find the town site. And it was sort of this meditation on home. And so it was I was commissioned to do about 7,500 words. So I kept a journal, and then I came home. I went for the week and I kept the journal, and then I came home and I transcribed the journal. And while I was there, I wanted to know more. And so I was actually turned into a journalist while I was there. I found all these people, I was interviewing them, I was going to community meetings. It just turned into a whole thing. So when I transcribed my notes, I had about 20,000 words of notes, but it was still it was more of like a literary journalism of like the story of me going back there and talking to people. It wasn't until later, as I started to work on it and revise it and show it to readers, Marguerite Duras aside, show it to readers and get feedback from people, that I then started to incorporate all of this historical research and talking about the history of the treaties in Canada. So you end up having my personal reflections, the story. Oh, and then all of that stuff about the opening chapters, which recounts my own family's immigrant experience, coming to Canada, living in Winnipeg, all of that juxtaposed against the story of the Pimicikamak and the story of the dam and the story of the treaties. Just then it became this whole book. And I think what you have in your book is you have the actual story in the present of the tiger, the narrator, and Ben. Then you have the mother and the fairy tales that are being told. Then you actually have the grandmother's letters that come in the back half of the book. And what I thought was really interesting was the actual commentary on the grandmother's letters, the footnotes and the annotations and all of that, in terms of like, they're trying to make sense of this different mode actually. And that's where I really saw you combining poetry and prose, not necessarily because the grandmother's writing is any more, lyric than everything else, because the whole thing is lyrical, but at least typographically and in the surface of the language and the diction, it's like an extreme shift from the rest of the book. So I did see your book as not only polyvocal in terms of various different characters speaking, but also multi-genre, like multiple modes of prose in there. I think you could have gotten away with any label. I mean, you have your, it is called a novel, which is fine, but I think it could be anything,
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you mentioned that, because when I was first writing, it was actually a collection of essays, and I was thinking a lot of the woman warrior when I was writing it. And I think like the essays that I was first writing, they were very kind of like took on all these different magical and fabulous elements. And I was like, Maxine Hong Kingston, she's done things that are kind of like this. And then as the process went on, I realized that there was a kind of cohesive thread that I wanted, or not fully cohesive, but there was a kind of threading of these different pieces that I wanted to pursue, and that kind of opened it into all these different other places. And then it became a novel, quote unquote. But yeah, it's really interesting too that like the origins of this memoir too was first in this like magazine piece. I'm so fascinated, fascinated by that. And yeah, I think one thing is really interesting too, or maybe this is just my kind of like experience with student journalism very briefly when I was in high school, was there was always this idea that was presented to me that like journalism has to have this like really intense objectivity, and this idea that like if you in any way kind of show yourself or show this certain way, then it's like different. It's like advocacy journalism. It's all these different things. And I always felt very kind of like scared and frightened of like journalism because of that. And I was really interested in how like what that journalistic process was like, of like recording these interactions and these dialogue and all these like very beautiful and meticulous details. And then also what I thought was really beautiful is like, bringing in these different narratives of like familial history and migration history, and like accounting for the self amidst like this kind of idea of journalism being this like quote unquote removed from self thing.
Well, I mean, throughout the book I'm sort of obsessed with clarifying that I'm not a journalist. And I think somewhere at some point near the end of the book, I think at the brunch, at the Mother's Day brunch, I think I just like, whatever, maybe I am a journalist. It doesn't really matter. But I think what is critically important, and this is an ethical question for journalists and scholars who work with Indigenous communities, is what is the responsibility for the community? And are you going to that community with the intention of supporting and building that community up, rather than like so there's a conversation near the beginning of Northern Light where I call Laylee Long Soldier, who is a friend of mine, and kind of worry about what does it mean ethically for me to go. And because they've invited me at that point already, they've invited me to participate in the Sweat Lodge. And it's Laylee who says, the fact that they invited you means that they're asking you not just to go there and report on them. they're inviting you into the community in a way. And so I always felt from the get-go that the concept of homecoming and going back to that land, I was looking for something, you know? I mean, I call myself Canadian, and you might call yourself American. I'm not sure if you do or not, but the place I grew up and learned language was not actually Canadian national space. It was Pimicikamak, it was treaty land. And the landscape around which I grew, I mean, what was Canadian about that is questionable. It's become Canadian because the Canadian national mythos has made it Canadian. But I realized that this was actually a space to which I belonged to, and that it had and has claims on me in a certain way. And so I think there is some ethical responsibility, even now to this minute, having written this book and now having it going to be published in the world, and that my obligation and my relationship and that my connection to that community is ongoing. So that's somewhat beyond just being a journalist and going there and writing a story and then coming back.
Yeah.
The books are Bestiary and Northern Light. You can purchase them from the Indie Book House at Stuyvesant Plaza here on this page. The authors are K-Ming Chang and Kazim Ali. It's been wonderful spending time with you. And thank you to our online audiences who have given us over 1 million views here at the Writers Institute at SUNY Albany. Be well and be safe.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.